there. Welcome back to the Complicated Kids podcast. I'm your host, Gabrielle Nicolay, and today I am joined by the lovely and marvelous Erin Browning. Erin, thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me. It is good to be here and talk about the topics we want to talk about today. Important.
Totally. And we are going to go there right now. We're going to just dive right into the pool. So would you just start us off by telling us who you are and why you're here?
Sure. So I am educated as a speech language pathologist and an Ayurvedic health counselor. I love to travel. I am an innovative thinker and doer. And so that has made my career less narrow and less straight pathed. I was never a clinician that just had a job and worked at the clinic. From early on, I taught continuing ed classes. I just dug deep. I dug deep into executive function and cognitive changes and breathing and swallowing. And
why? Why do you think you did that? Because this is super interesting to me. And I'm kind of springing a little question on you here, because that has been my experience as well, which is, when we go to grad school for speech and language, we learn a lot about speech and language, and we don't learn a lot necessarily about people and about other systems, and about what works. So, and again, in fairness, it's a 2-year master's. Like, there's not a lot of time. You got to learn the basics first. Having said that, coming out of graduate school and into the real world, what you and I think both quickly figured out was like, oh, hang on, there's a lot more going on here. So why do you think, how did you get there?
So my personality, I'm a people person. I've never been the pediatric therapist or the adult therapist. I'm the complicated case therapist. So what has happened is people, somehow they just kept falling in my lap, the people that everybody passed over. Everybody passed over them. Oh, we've done all we can. Oh, I don't really think it's that severe. Oh, it seems like you're exaggerating these symptoms. And then I would end up with these cases, and I saw holes. I saw holes in the system. I saw holes in our system, even as SLPs. And again, I had a wonderful education. I went to graduate school at Marshall University in Huntington, West Virginia. Beautiful program. I felt well prepared for what they could give me in that time frame. But I am a digger. I am the person who reads the whole research article. I'm the person who remembers details in that way and wants to apply them. So it really just I challenged myself, I guess, that I wanted to fill these holes. I saw the gaps in the practice. I saw the gaps in healthcare, because I've always worked in more of a healthcare type setting or an outpatient related to a hospital, something that was more health centered than school centered or even community centered. I was much more health centered. And I just saw that we were missing it. We were missing big picture progress because we were focusing on minutia.
Okay. So, oh my God. Yes. All the things. So pick one of the holes and tell us about it.
Yeah, so I'll pick the current hole that I'm a bit obsessed about, and that's breathing. Yeah. So breathing is foundational, okay? It is. If you can't breathe, you can't speak, you can't eat. I mean, even if you just think about when you have a cold and your nasal passages are plugged up, how much more difficult is it to eat a meal? How much more difficult is it when your lungs are infected or inflamed to have a conversation? So the skills that we are supposed to be working on as SLPs go hand in hand with breathing. And then you pull in executive function. And there's lots of evidence to support that breathing changes the way the brain works. It just does. So I'm fascinated by the breathing system. I could be wrong, but I think it might be the only bodily system that that works passively and we can actively control it in the way we can.
I think you're right about that, actually. And
I mean, I know
someone will tell us whether we're right or wrong.
Yeah, yeah, but it's definitely not, there aren't many that do that.
Yep.
And
so not
you're
that
going
you
to
forgot.
breathe.
Yeah, I'm going to interrupt you because sleep.
Oh
Also.
yeah, we didn't talk about sleep. Yeah,
because
but that's
underneath all of that is if you don't breathe well, and your point about the cold is totally well taken, because I think that's an experience most people can relate to, which is like when you have a cold, you don't sleep well because you're not breathing well. And now think about kids who just kind of have a chronic level of that, and we're expected to function. So sorry. Executive
and then we're
function,
trying,
here we go.
Yeah, and we're trying to make kids learn. We're trying to make them sit and learn and do, and they're not able to even breathe. It's not reasonable. And so that's been my current kind of hole that I am focused on. And I love it because it gets to the root of things. Part of why I went back to school and became an Ayurvedic health counselor was because it's so holistic. It's so whole system. And I knew there were pieces I was missing. I didn't want to be a dietitian. I don't want it to be all dietary. I didn't want to be, it just made it was a good fit for me to look at a whole system in a non-allopathic way too. But that's where breathing, that's where I got really interested in breathing and incorporated into my practice, which is speech pathology, right? My practice is a clinic where I practice speech therapy, and every client I see, we work on body movement, we work on cervical stretching, we work on breathing. It helps the overall outcomes.
We forget that our ability to speak comes from the connection between our brains and our bodies. Like, I think sometimes we literally forget about that. Like, we're so busy down here at the mouth because we're like, well, lips have to be moving and jaw has to be moving, and all that's true, that we forget to look lower and we forget to look higher.
Yeah. And I will even go a step further and say my belief is that the breath is like a gateway between the brain and the body. The breath changes the way the autonomic nervous system works. The breath, if used properly, and that doesn't mean the same thing for everyone or on the same day. So there are a variety of techniques that we would use to help breathing based on the individual. But if used properly, the breath will help control the brain, will help the brain optimize for learning and talking and eating and sleeping.
Yeah. Okay. So good. Tell me about, so I want you to define allopathic for folks who may not know kind of that distinction.
Yeah.
And then I would love to hear more about the Ayurvedic health counseling, like what that entails.
Yeah. So allopathic medicine is what is practiced, and it is super wonderful, right? Like, we have germs and we know how to fix them. We have a broken arm and we go in and they put a cast on, they x-ray it, they put a cast on it. So it is problem and solution driven. A non-allopathic approach, which often we talk about as more of an Eastern medicine approach. And specifically what I know is Ayurveda. Ayurveda is ancient Indian medicine. It is more, I'm going to just say preventative. It is more looking at the system and imbalances or difficulties with like pumping and processing and digesting things, not just food, information, but the ability to process. And how can we make that more efficient before we ever find the problems? That's what Ayurvedic medicine is.
I'm getting, as you're talking, I'm like, it's about where the boulders are in the stream and moving the boulders or making them smaller so that the water can get to where it needs to go.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
That's
a great analogy. Yeah, really making them smaller. Really, the thing is like, how do we find the balance? And it's so cool that you're talking about that, because the essence of Ayurveda is actually the 5 elements. Like, and I don't talk about that a lot in this vein of work because people are like, five elements, what? Yeah. But that is the essence of Ayurveda, is that we are all made up of earth, our bones, water, the fluids within our body, fire, our heart, our digestion, ether, the space. Did I miss one?
Yeah.
Wind, our breath. How did I miss that?
Oh my God, I have full goosebumps right now.
Yeah. So that's the essence of Ayurveda. And again, in my current practice, somebody says, I really want an Ayurvedic health consultation, I will do a few minor things to help with daily routine, but I would send, if somebody's really suffering, I would send them to somebody who does that day in and day out.
Sure.
But I have that knowledge that I can apply to the people who need help with breathing, eating, speaking.
Yeah. And this is what's so interesting to me about the field in general, and why I haven't really like exited stage left yet, which is you can bring in so many other, and I feel like it is incumbent on speech language pathologists to do this, because we are looking through a narrow lens, and we can miss the forest for the trees if we don't kind of pop our heads up every once in a while and be like, oh, there's a whole body sitting in front of me. Oh, there's a body who goes home and doesn't sleep well. Okay, well, how am I dealing with that? And instead of banging my head against the wall trying to teach pronouns, for example, which is something I saw on one of the Facebook groups. I'm in a couple of speech language pathology Facebook groups, and like people will ask questions and the answer is like 3 layers down from where they're thinking about it.
Yeah. And it's interesting. So I'm going to circle back to where we started with, and I hope you have young SLPs listening to this.
Yeah.
Or families. If you have families listening to this, like that are looking at what your SLPs are doing, push the SLPs and say, what about this? What about this? I benefited from that as a young clinician. I benefited from that. And I'll tell you a story. So a few years ago, I had this person friend me on social media and send a message and say, my name is such and such, and you were my speech therapist when I was 6 years old. And I was a student. I was a student at a rotation, right? And this young woman is now an adult, and she had pretty significant autism. She was very echolalic. She was little, and one of the goals, because when you're a student, you go in and you do the goals that are set. And again, this was 20 years ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I remember sitting at a table with this little girl and holding up a Barbie and a Ken and working on he and she. And so she said, what did you teach me? And I said, well, shamefully, I taught you he and she with Barbie and Ken. And it was ridiculous. I mean, and I kind of just spelled it out. But instinctively as a young clinician, I remember thinking, she's going to learn that Barbie and Ken are he and she. And this is not, so yeah, beyond the pronoun conversation, which is relevant.
Totally. And listen, this is
the ridiculous stuff we do.
The hyper gendered, I mean, like, again, like, but I think it's one example of like the hyper split the hyper dichotomization is not even a word, of like categories of things, of what we're teaching, is like, it can be very dangerous.
We're focusing in on these minute details oftentimes without seeing the big picture.
Yeah.
And that is, and I think we're trying. On the whole, the field is trying.
Absolutely.
It just takes more pushing. It takes clinicians like us saying, this is good, and some of it doesn't make sense. I need things that also are sensible.
Right.
In the world. Like, what is the functionality of this? What is the functionality of the things you're working on, and how's that carrying over? And I think it takes families pushing too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
that's hard because you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
So, which is kind of the purpose of this podcast, is right.
Yeah.
Largely for parents who have kids who are not following kind of a regular, like, you just kind of feed and water them and they grow. these are kids who are, they're different a little bit. They need other things, but the parents don't know what they need. And so that's why these conversations. When somebody comes into your practice, so you're in private practice.
I'm in private practice. I'm in Massachusetts, Melrose, Mass, which is right outside of Boston on the North Shore.
Okay. And so when people come to your practice, just out of curiosity, because, like I have a process, everybody has a process. What's your process? Like you do some kind of intake and then what happens?
I do an intake. So generally speaking, I just talk to people for about 15 or 20 minutes before we decide if I'm going to even assess the client, because sometimes it's not a good fit. Sometimes they would much rather have something more traditional.
Yep.
And I'm not saying that I don't work on traditional things. We will certainly fix your child's speech, right? We will certainly, but my approach is just more holistic. And so families call, they talk with me for a few minutes. We kind of decide if it's going to be a good fit. And then I do an assessment. And so that is also individualized. When I initiated the private practice, I thought I'm going to do an assessment of everything on everyone. I have found that that's not always needed. It's not always what I need to do. So in order to be more efficient with resources, I don't always do every single thing. And then if something else arises, then I bring in more assessment tools. And I'm also an out-of-network provider, which means I don't take insurance. And largely I do that because I don't want to lock myself into such a cookie cutter plan. So here in Massachusetts, people vacate in the summers often. They go to the Cape for a month. They go somewhere not here in the heat and mugginess of Boston and so when you get involved in having a very rote plan, there's less wiggle room. And how do we navigate this? How does a family say, gosh, we have 3 super busy weeks?
Yep. I
say, okay, great. I'll see you on week 4. If I had an insurance company that I was looping in with, it would mean more reports, more wasted resources, actually, in my opinion. So that's part of that decision is let's assess and let's come up with a plan that works for the family. Sometimes they come into my clinic. Sometimes we do a hybrid virtual and clinic or home and clinic. Yeah.
Stop you there for a second, because this is an interesting kind of, as we're talking about holistic kinds of things and allopathic medicine, right? Because it is challenging. And I have this as well, because when people come in often, and because I deal with very young children most of the time,
yes,
I'm not doing a lot of formal assessment ever. I am doing what I call a functional assessment, which I know you're a fan of. It's like, how are you operating? Like, can you get your needs met? Are you emotionally available, grounded, and regulated? Like, how is this working for you? And often the answer is it's not, because they're coming to see me. And then there's a communication issue there. And so we're dealing on all the levels, right? We're dealing with sleep, and we're dealing with routine, and we're dealing with predictability, and we're dealing with parenting style, and we're dealing maybe with some language and speech stuff.
Yes.
In order to fit into an insurance-based model, that we have to think of our clients as having an illness.
Correct. And it's not right.
And it's not right.
It's not right. There are just some differences. There are some differences in the way the world is processed, the way that people interact with the world. We're all different. The way you interact in the world, the way I interact in the world, it's all different. And if we go at it from the medical model to get the insurance reimbursement in that particular way, it's problematic. Now, the good thing is, like, what I have found is if families have health savings account or flex spending account, they can use that to pay for these services because it's coded and it's reasonable. And I'm a licensed practitioner, which is important. And there's also still a missing gap that for the people who probably need it the most that don't have means,
Yeah.
it's nearly inaccessible. I'm trying to work that out. I'm trying
Me
to
too.
figure that out in the private practice world. How do I provide that and do it in a way that's thoughtful and functional?
Yeah. That I've been asking myself the same question for 10
Yeah.
years, which tells
Yeah.
you.
It's hard.
Yeah.
It's really hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so people come to you, you do whatever kind of assessment they need, and then you work a schedule
Yeah.
that works for them,
Yeah.
and then you see what happens.
And then we see what happens. And I do tend to I don't reassess, but I do tend to kind of every 3 months, like 90 days, I have a reminder to revisit the plan.
Yep.
But honestly, I kind of feel like therapy is an ongoing assessment always. If we aren't continually assessing, and looking at those root causes, we're going to miss the boat.
So I'm so happy that you said that, because I always say, like, in my head, it's like, this is diagnostic therapy or therapeutic diagnosis, right? Where over time, we're constantly making, if we're doing our jobs right, I believe, we're constantly making shifts. I saw a kiddo yesterday who I see several times a week for a feeding disorder. She was out there because of some medication that she's taking. If I go in and expect that we're going to have the same performance because we had it last week, I am setting myself up for a world of hurt. And by the way, I'm going to break her trust, because now I'm asking her to do things that she is neurophysiologically incapable of doing today.
Yeah, I mean, even last week was a disaster in my practice because it was back to school. Every kid was grouchy, tired, they were just out of routine. We're humans.
Yeah.
We are all humans, and humans are not meant to just perform.
Yeah.
We're not meant to just perform to get the skill.
That. And I think if I get all the way down, that's the piece of my grad school education that I eschew the most.
Yeah.
I use a very big vocabulary word in conversation, right? Because it's like we were taught, right? Task reinforcer, task reinforcer, task reinforcer. And if you do have the right reinforcer, and this is all of ABA, by the way, applied behavioral analysis.
Yep.
See last week's podcast or a recent podcast. It won't be last week, but it's not the only way that humans learn and work. It is a small part of the way that some humans learn and work some things.
Correct. And I mean, in my opinion, I think it at times backfires because it becomes coercive. And
Yes.
we as human beings don't like to be coerced into something. We like to do things that are meaningful and purposeful. And because our systems are able to handle it and feel good. Like I think that's often the most intrinsic motivation. We're doing something because it feels good.
And because it brings us into closer relationship with somebody else.
Yeah.
Who we know loves us and who we love. This is
Yeah.
the other piece of my practice, which is, and I can tell that you have this too, which is like, if you don't like me, then you're not going to learn anything from me.
Correct.
Right. And I mean, I feel lucky because I like most kids. So like I am extending that, right? I'm usually able to get out of my own way in terms of like, okay, what is it that you need and how can I sort of shapeshift into that? But there have been kids who have come to my practice where I'm like, this is just not a good fit. You don't like me. It's fine.
Yeah.
Go somewhere else. It's good.
Yes. Yes. And that's okay.
Yeah. But
And
that
that's okay.
relationship
It's
is
big.
it's like the core.
Yeah. I'm actually preparing a little talk that I'm doing, and it's about breath work, but I'm also talking about my practice. And this is the first time I've actually said this out loud. Let me see if I can even remember it. So I was saying that in my practice, we relate, we regulate, and then we rehabituate or rehabilitate.
Yeah.
Habit, it depends on what we're working on, but I'm speaking very clearly about myofunctional work, and some of the feeding and swallowing things, but that's it. Relate, regulate, and then rehabilitate or rehabituate. It's perfect. It's all, we have to do the other two pieces.
And you have to do them first.
Yeah. And I think this is important for families to understand too. I think that it's important for clinicians to overtly talk about that part. Not just, okay, so we might say as clinicians, well, I'm building rapport in our minds, but if we aren't discussing this with families, like I think the families that listen to your podcast need to watch out for that. Are the clinicians trying to build relationship with the kids?
Yeah. Yeah.
Are they telling you, I'm trying to form a relationship with your child or you, or, and build trust?
Well, and I think this is like, so from a SLP, from a speech language pathologist perspective, I have felt in the past, and I know that there are people listening who are SLPs who will feel this way too, that time somehow is not wasted, but is necessary, but we can't talk about it because it's not actually the work. It's like this pre-work that we have to do before we get to the real work, but it's not. And what you're saying is blowing it right out of the water. And of course it's true that is in fact, it is the work, because what we know about neurology is nobody is learning anything in the absence of a relationship that matters and in the absence of a body and a brain that are available. And so like, you cannot do your job, you can't do the work if child is running away from you and hates you.
It's almost like we have spent, okay, so I'm going to liken it to games and Candyland, right?
Okay, yeah.
So we don't talk about the fact that there's a lot of time spent in speech therapy in other, I mean, I don't necessarily, I have 0 games. I don't like to play games. It's just because I don't like to play games though. But that's a pretty big thing that happens in speech. It's like, what's the game that we're going to do?
Yeah.
And it's not what we need to be doing, right? And nobody really talks about like that they spent all this time finding the game, preparing the game. It's like this part has replaced the games at this point, and we aren't talking about any of it.
Yeah.
We aren't talking about any of that, and it needs to be, and I actually think games are rapport building for some children, but I just don't like them very much.
Yeah.
the games.
But this is the other point, which is, and I say this to parents all the time too, which is like, what we do does not matter.
Yeah.
It's how we do it. Yeah. And how what we're doing makes us feel, and therefore the client feel, and then that loop.
Yeah.
One of the things I do when I'm coaching parents, and I have sometimes I do a virtual coaching where I'm in the parent's ear, but nobody can see me.
That's great. Yeah.
Oh, it's amazing. So I call it screenless coaching because anyway, we did it during the pandemic because there were kids who were trying to be on the screen with the therapist.
Yeah.
And then were trying to get mom's attention and they couldn't handle it. So I was like, you know what? Shut me off. I don't need to be here. I can tell you what to do. Yeah. And so it's like a guided play session for parents where they get to learn what to say, when to say it. And we can tailor the linguistic environment. We can tailor the temporal environment, meaning like we can slow stuff way down.
Yep.
And this little coach in their ear. Okay. Why did I start telling you this story? I don't remember.
We're talking about games and we're talking about the things we don't talk about.
Yeah. So it's literally does not matter what we do as long as we are available to the child. So a parent who is allegedly playing with their child, but they're constantly looking at their phone, or they're trying to control the action, or they're worried about dinner, that is a different energy, even though they might still be sitting on the floor with their child, than being fully open, fully available, and fully curious to notice, okay, what's happening now? I wonder why he's doing that. Huh, interesting, right? All of a sudden, you've blown up the to-do list, and you've opened up this space between the two of you where now, and I can get a little bit woo about this too, where there's energy zinging between the two of you. And we can feel that.
Yes.
And I'll say to parents, I'll be like, there'll be a moment and you can absolutely feel it. I mean, anybody watching would be able to feel it and see it. And I'm like, do you feel that softening in your gut?
Mhm.
That's the thing. That's what we're going for. The rest is just like techniques to get to that. It's not
Yes.
about the game.
Well, and I will bring it back to the nervous system. When that happens, the autonomic nervous system has very likely shifted into a more parasympathetic state.
Yes.
It's out of fight or flight, parasympathetic. Can I explain?
Yes, please do.
So the autonomic nervous system is not a thinking part of the brain. You cannot think your way from one side to the other. And it's not an actual side, but just you can't shift the gears from fight or flight to rest, digest. Rest and digest is where we actually connect and relate as well. Fight or flight also looks like freeze. It also looks like the kid hiding. It looks like your meltdowns. It looks like the kid running around the room. It looks like the kid putting their head down on the desk and pulling their hoodie up because they're overwhelmed.
Yep.
So you can't think your way from one side to the other in that autonomic nervous system. One of my biggest tricks is breathing. And sometimes you don't even have to instruct breathing. You just start breathing differently.
Yes.
You breathe differently. Guess what happens? They breathe differently. You set differently. They set differently. So that can shift. That's how you shift. The breath is one of the most powerful tools to shift from sympathetic into parasympathetic. So the exhalation very specifically activates the vagus nerve. Exhalation, especially when we vocalize, activates the vagus nerve. And then you go into parasympathetic.
I love it. Oh my God. And there
Yeah.
we have a full circle, and we're going to pin it because you and I could go all day, as is the case with many of these conversations, which I just so love having. Thank you.
Yeah, it's fabulous.
If people want to learn more about you, how do they do that?
So you can go to my website. It's evolved-therapy.com. I do private practice. I'm licensed in Massachusetts, West Virginia, Arizona, and I have Maryland, Virginia, and California on deck that should be happening soon because I do a lot of telehealth work.
Fantastic. So if you are in any of those locations, you may contact Erin. Contact her anyway.
Yeah. And I love that we just talked about the relatability piece. I think that is key. I think that's key. I mean, honestly, can I add something here? So I think that the families who are listening to this, if you don't know your clinician as a human being, okay, and I'm not saying you go to dinner together or you know the in and outs of their life, but if they are just this like entity that works on the goals, you probably want to dig a little deeper or look elsewhere. I feel like that is a piece of therapy, is learning who we are as human beings and realizing that it is not unprofessional to be a human. It is not
bumper sticker. It's not unprofessional to be a human.
Yeah.
So good.
Yeah. Yeah. And there are professional boundaries in that and personal boundaries in that. But I think it's super helpful for families to see, who this is as a person.
Yeah. Because that's the relationship is, again, at the center of everything that we do.
Yeah.
Erin Browning, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.